like soup? I wonder what your favourite kind of soup is. Hello everyone, I'm Kathleen Pelly. Welcome to Journey with Story. Today's story is an old folk tale about a tramp who manages to trick an old woman into making soup from a nail. Oh, a tramp is just a person who travels from place to place looking for work. Let's take a journey then with The Old Woman and the Tramp, or as it's sometimes also called, nail soup. There once was a tramp who went plodding his way through a forest. The distance between the houses was so great that he had little hope of finding a shelter before the night set in. But all of a sudden he saw some lights between the trees. He then discovered a cottage where there was a fire burning in the grate. How nice it would be to roast oneself before that fire, and to get a bite of something, he thought. And so he dragged himself towards the cottage. Just then an old woman came toward him. "Good evening," said the tramp. "Good evening," said the woman. "Where do you come from?" "Ah, south of the sun and east of the moon," said the tramp. "And now I am on the way home again, for I have been all over the world with the exception of this town," he said. "Well, you must be a great traveller then," said the woman. "What may your business be here?" "Oh, I want a shelter for the night," he said. "I thought as much," said the woman, "but you may as well get away from here at once, for my husband is not at home, and my place is not an inn," she said. "My good woman," said the tramp, "you must not be so cross and hard-hearted, for we are both human beings, and we should help one another. It is written." "Help one another," said the woman. "Help? Did you ever hear such a thing? Who'll help me, do you think? I haven't got a morsel in the house. No, you'll have to look for lodgings elsewhere," she said. But the tramp would not give up. Although the old woman grumbled and complained as much as she could, he was just as persistent as ever and went on begging and praying like a starved dog until at last she gave in and he got permission to lie on the floor for the night. That was very kind, he thought, and he thanked her for it. "Better on the floor without sleep than suffer cold in the forest deep," he said, for he was a merry fellow, this tramp, and was always ready with a rhyme. When he came into the room, he could see that the woman was not so badly off as she had pretended. But she was a greedy and stingy woman of the worst sort, and she was always complaining and grumbling. He now made himself very agreeable, of course, and asked her in his most polite manner for something to eat. "Where am I to get it from?" said the woman. "I haven't tasted a morsel myself the whole day." But the tramp was a cunning fellow, he was. "Oh, poor old granny, you must be starving," he said. Well, I suppose I shall have to ask you to have something with me then." "Have something with you?" said the woman. "You don't look as if you could ask anyone of anything. What have you got to offer? I should like to know." "He who far and wide does roam sees many things not known at home, and he who many things has seen has wits about him and senses keen," said the tramp. "Better dead than lose one's head. Lend me a pot, granny." The old woman now became very inquisitive, and so she let him have a pot. He filled it with water and put it on the fire, and then he blew with all his might till the fire was burning fiercely all around it. Then he took a 4-inch nail from his pocket, turned it 3 times in his hand, and put it into the pot. The woman stared with all her might. "What is this going to be?" she asked. "Nail broth," said the tramp. The old woman had seen and heard a good deal in her time, but that anybody could have made broth with a nail, well, she'd never heard the like before. "That's something for poor people to know," she said, "and I should like to learn how to make it." "That which is not worth having will always go a-begging," said the tramp. But if she wanted to learn how to make it, she had only to watch him, he said, and he went on stirring the broth. The old woman squatted on the ground, her hands clasping her knees and her eyes following his hand as he stirred the broth. "This generally makes good broth," he said, "but this time it will be very likely rather thin, for I have been making broth the whole week with the same nail. If one only had a handful of sifted oatmeal to put in it, that would make it all right," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about," and so he stirred the broth again. "Well, I think I have a scrap of flour somewhere," said the old woman, and went out to fetch some, and it was both good and fine. The tramp began putting the flour into the broth and went on stirring, while the woman sat staring now at him and then at the pot, until her eyes nearly burst their sockets. "This broth would be good enough for company," he said, putting in one handful of flour after another. "If I had only a bit of salted beef and a few potatoes to put in, it would be fit for gentle folks, however particular they might be," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about." When the old woman really began to think it over, she thought she had some potatoes, and perhaps a bit of beef as well. And so these she gave the tramp, who went on stirring while she sat and stared as hard as ever. "This will be grand enough for the best in the land," he said. "Well, I never," said the woman, "and just fancy all with a nail. He was really a wonderful man, that tramp. He could do more than drink a sup and turn the tankard up, he could. If one had only a little barley and a drop of milk, we could ask the king himself to have some of it," he said. "For this is what he has every blessed evening that I know, for I have been in service under the king's cook," he said. "Dear me, ask the king to have some? Well, I never," exclaimed the woman, slapping her knees. She was quite awestruck at the tramp and his grand connections. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about." And then the woman remembered she had a little barley, and as for milk, well, she wasn't quite out of that, she said, for her best cow had just calved, and then she went to fetch both the one and the other. The tramp went on stirring, and the woman sat staring one moment at him and the next at the pot. Then all at once the tramp took out the nail. "Now it's ready, and now we'll have a real good feast," he said. But to this kind of soup, the king and the queen always take a dram or two and one sandwich at least, and then they always have a cloth on the table when they eat, he said. But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about. But by this time the old woman herself had begun to feel quite grand and fine, I can tell you. And if that was all that was wanted to make it just as the king had it, she thought it would be nice to have it just the same way for once, and play at being king and queen with the tramp. She went straight to the cupboard and brought out her best bottle of brandy, her glasses, butter and cheese, smoked beef and veal, until at last the table looked as if it were decked out for company. Never in her life had the old woman had such a grand feast, and never had she tasted such broth, and just fancy, made only with a nail. She was in such a good and merry humour at having learnt such an economical way of making broth that she did not know how to make enough of the tramp who had taught her such a useful thing. So they ate and they drank, and they ate and they drank until they both became tired and sleepy, and the tramp was now going to lie down on the floor. But that would never do, thought the old woman. No, that was impossible. Such a grand person must have a bed to lie in, she said. He did not need much pressing. It's just like sweet Christmas time, he said, and a nicer woman I never came across. Well, happy are they who meet with such good people, said he, and he lay down on the bed and he went to sleep. And the next morning when he woke up, the first thing he got was a cup of hot coffee. When he was going, the old woman gave him a bright $1 piece and said, "Thanks, many, many thanks for what you have taught me. Now I shall live in comfort, since I have learnt how to make broth with a nail." "Oh, no, said the tramp. "It is I who must thank you. It was what you added that made the difference." The old woman stood at the cottage door and waved him goodbye with a smile on her face. And the tramp walked on down the road, whistling a merry tune. He paused for just a second to pat the nail in his pocket, just to make sure it was still there. Well, you might have heard another version of this story called Stone Soup, where instead of a nail, a stone is used to make the soup. I wonder, if you wanted to make a delicious soup, what would you put into it? Maybe you could share and compare your ingredients with your family and friends. Cheerio then, join me next time for Journey with Story.